It's the 25th of March 1119. A young French knight named Pierre Basile is standing duty in the castle of Châlus-Chabrol in the southwest of France. He's one of just 2 knights currently stationed at the castle. They're not expecting much trouble deep in these provincial heartlands. But then, as Pierre Basile looks over the ramparts, he sees the worst sight possible. Marching over the horizon is an army headed by the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, a veteran of the Third Crusade, undefeated in open battle and renowned for his ferocity. Upon seeing the English approach, the Frenchmen inside the fortress scramble to try and put up some defence against these insurmountable odds. But the castle itself is so ill prepared for a fight that Basile has to resort to cobbling together armour out of whatever he could find, including using a makeshift shield constructed from a frying pan. Although an act of incredible determination and bravery, choosing to resist such overwhelming odds will have consequences for young Basile. Within just 2 weeks, he'll die one of the worst deaths imaginable, as his skin is torn from his living flesh in a process known as flaying. But it doesn't go down how you might think. When the English spot this undermanned, under-equipped fortress, they conclude that this probably won't be the most challenging fight. So much so that King Richard himself feels confident to stroll around the castle grounds without even wearing his armour. Young Basile sees the King of England roaming unprotected, and it's just too good of a target. He lifts his crossbow over the ramparts, lines up his sight, and lets loose the bow. He sees the bolt fly through the air and sink directly into the king's chest. Bullseye. The mortally wounded king was pulled back to his tent, and with this, Basile expected that the invaders would just pack up and leave. But to his surprise, the siege continued just as before, and within less than a week, he would be captured by the English besiegers. Once in custody, he's dragged before Richard the Lionheart, who it turns out is not dead from the crossbow bolt, but is nonetheless dying from gangrene, which has begun to fester within the wound itself. Richard asks young Basile why he had struck him with the crossbow, and instead of trying to claim it was an accident or an unfortunate byproduct of war, Basile looks this dying king in the eye and tells him flatly that it was vengeance for his brothers dying at the hands of the English. Although not known for his sensitivity, Richard is moved by the young knight's bravery and honesty, and as his final act on earth, he grants the boy mercy. He tells the young Basile, "Live on, and by my bounty behold the light of day." With this, the dying king gives the knight 100 shillings and sends him away in peace. And shortly after, he dies in his mother's arms on the 6th of April, 1199. However, upon Richard's death, the king's right-hand man, a mercenary named Mercadier, takes control of the situation, and he's in no mood for mercy. Whatever the king's last wishes may have been, there was no way in hell that Mercadier was going to let this king-killing crossbowman go in peace. He had Pierre Basile arrested, and as punishment for the regicide, he ordered that Pierre be put to death by the process of flaying. We have very few details about the specific case of Pierre Basile, but flaying was used regularly within medieval Europe, and as a result, we know quite a bit about how it would be typically performed. Be warned though, the process is pretty grim. Usually, you would start by curing or blanching the skin, which in hotter regions would mean tying someone outside to suffer extreme sunburn, or more likely in the case of Basile, boiling water would be poured over the body inch by inch in order to inflame the skin, making the process of peeling it away that much easier for the executioner. It should go without saying that this alone would be excruciatingly painful, as the victim suffers third-degree burns over the entirety of their body. Boiling water is repeatedly poured onto the skin over and over, causing the flesh to soften and the dermis, the thick inner layer of your skin, to loosen. In the case of flaying, however, this unimaginable pain is just the prelude to the real horror. The process can vary a little bit between time and place, but generally, the executioner would want to keep as much of your skin intact as possible, preferably tearing away the entire layer in one piece. To this end, you would be tied with your limbs outstretched, sometimes upside down, and then the executioner would slice a ring around your ankles and wrists before working inwards towards the centre of your body. The executioners would then begin to peel your skin away section by section, but sometimes they would kind of peel as they went until they felt confident that your skin was loose enough, at which point one man would grab the loose tag on each arm and they would both pull the entirety of your skin away in one violent but precise tug. In either case, it would be unthinkable pain, honestly unlike anything words could describe. We cover a lot of historical torture and execution methods on this channel, and most of them have a component of internal trauma, like impalement, or being hanged, drawn and quartered. And although they're grim, if we're just going to measure pain alone, being flayed alive is in a totally different league. Thousands upon thousands of nerve receptors inside the dermis would be screaming after the skin was blanched with boiling water, and now those same receptors are firing away as the skin is being ripped away from the flesh, and then finally these receptors, now raw and hypersensitive, are left completely exposed without the protective skin, meaning that even a simple breeze would cause a wave of white-hot pain to completely overwhelm the victim. The limbic system, the part of your brain responsible for regulating emotion, would become utterly overwhelmed by this complete and total trauma, meaning that even the most steadfast and courageous victims would be reduced to a whimpering mess, screaming in agony and begging their tormentors for mercy through a cacophony of crying and tears. Fading in and out of consciousness was almost always a guarantee, but victims could quickly be brought back around with cold water either to the face or that newly exposed flesh. The process could last anywhere from 30 minutes to 5 or 6 hours, depending on the proficiency of the knifeman and the severity of the sentence. And here's where it gets even worse. Flaying someone alive doesn't kill them, at least not for a while. No major blood vessels or internal organs are damaged during the process, so there's nothing to actually put a victim out of their misery. If left to their own devices, the victim could last hours or days until they would finally perish from either infection or hypothermia, as their body is left without its protective layer with which to cope with the outside world. If you are really lucky, you might die from shock during the process, as the body tries to compute this unbelievable level of trauma. But that's if you're lucky. Most people would need to be killed or left to die after the procedure had been completed. And by the way, the sheer state that the victims would work themselves into was often enough to have an effect on the people watching, and there are cases of this brutal method of execution actually causing harm to the spectators, including one case, which we'll get into later. In the case of Pierre Basile, we know he managed to survive the entire procedure because once the entirety of the skin had been removed from his body, this screaming, walking corpse was dragged to a makeshift gallows where he was finally hanged. And all this to a man that, let's not forget, had been publicly pardoned by a king. Justice was rough in the medieval period, and as for Macadier, the man who ordered this punishment, he would also get a taste when a year later, some other mercenaries ambushed him and put him to the sword in Bordeaux. But despite how utterly savage this whole tale was, it's not really that unusual for medieval Europe. In 1303, Richard of Pudlicot, an English wool merchant, robbed part of King Edward I's treasury at Westminster Abbey. He, along with his high-ranked accomplices, primarily consisting of monks from the abbey, stole enough of the king's gems, antique gold and coins to equate to about a year's tax revenue for the entire Kingdom of England. Once captured, Richard tried to save his accomplices by giving a false confession that he was the only one involved in the crime. Nevertheless, Over a dozen others were also found guilty, and they were hanged and then flayed, all for the crime of stealing from the crown. Legend has it that Richard's flayed skin was nailed to the door of Westminster Abbey as a warning to other aspiring criminals. Now, before you start thinking that this is just a medieval thing, you should know that flaying is probably one of the oldest methods of torture that we have records for, which isn't surprising, given that the point of all of these cruelties is to install terrifying fear into the population, and flaying is nothing else if not absolutely terrifying. As early as the 9th century BC, ancient kings, such as Ashurnasirpal II, were flaying people, and the act was as much about propaganda as it was about punishment or revenge. To quote Ashurnasirpal directly, "I have made a pillar facing the city gate, and have flayed all the rebel leaders. I have clad the pillar in their flayed skins. I let the leaders of the conquered cities be flayed, and clad the city walls with their skins." And it wasn't just a verbal warning, they even went to the effort of inscribing the events onto stone pillars, which is what you're looking at right now. So it really is a punishment as old as time, and as execution methods go, it's also stood the test of time quite well. In the late 18th century, a shipbuilder from Crete named Daskaloggianis tried to lead a revolt against the Ottoman Empire, but when the rebellion failed, he was forced to surrender. The Ottomans had actually promised clemency to all the rebels that surrendered and agreed to pay up their taxes, but once they got their hands on Daskaloggianis, they switched tacts and decided instead to make an example of him. And so, on the 17th of June 1771, he was flayed alive before a crowd, before ultimately being beaten to death. It was reported that he suffered the entire ordeal in complete silence, but his brother was forced to watch the entire affair, which caused him to suffer a mental break, and he fell into a state of insanity from which he was never able to properly recover. It doesn't just stop there though, we have cases as late as the Second World War, one in 1941 involving a Serbian priest named Daman Šterbac, who was skinned alive by Croatian fascists in Jadovno concentration camp before being tossed into a pit to expire. Although his detainers attempted to replace his name with the prisoner identification number 577, his real name would eventually become immortalised when he was canonised as a saint by the Serbian Orthodox Church. The other case during World War II was said to have happened in Lyon, where a French resistance fighter was reportedly flayed by the Butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie, sometime between 1942 and 1944. But we would still be at this even after the horrors of the Second World War, even as late as today, where it remains an infamous use of execution amongst organised crime gangs in Central and South America. All of this kind of begs the question. Unlike classical punishments, like crucifixion, the breaking wheel, or being hanged, drawn and quartered, why do we see flaying nearly everywhere? It turns up in the 9th century BC and follows us until today in the 21st century. It's there in medieval Europe, and it's there in Ming China. I mean, it's a really complicated and drawn out process, but at the same time, it's so prevalent across so many times and places. What's the deal? In Ernst G. Jung's book, A Short Cultural History of Skin, he argues that flaying can be seen across so many cultures and eras for 3 reasons. 1, it's an absolutely terrifying spectacle, which makes it perfect for installing terror into any who were forced to witness the affair. 2, the skin is the part of our body that everyone sees and recognises us by. Let's not forget that our faces are, of course, covered in skin. By removing this part of a person, one doesn't just sentence them to excruciating pain, but one also takes away a key part of their identity, making them no longer a person, but instead a living, breathing spectacle of suffering. When you look at someone who's been flayed, you don't see the face of a person anymore. That's been stripped away. What's left is the face of horror itself. Third and lastly, there's a quasi-religious, symbolic thing going on here that lots of cultures have picked up on. From Christian imagery of martyrs who've been flayed, holding their own skin in heaven, such as St. Bartholomew in Michelangelo's The Last Testament, all the way to the Mesoamerican god Xipe, the god of birth, death and rebirth, who flayed himself to give food to humanity and is usually depicted red to represent the fact that he's missing his own skin. I think it's interesting that in both cases, the symbolism of rebirth is front and centre, with St. Bartholomew being reborn in heaven, and Xipe, or our Lord the Flayed One, is quite literally the deity of rebirth. Regardless of the religious symbolism, though, there are many ways that one can shed their skin and become reborn into something more authentically and truly themselves. And I think we can all agree that being flayed alive is by far and away the worst way that you can shed this layer.